It had been almost 15 years since 3 people were found dead inside a Miami-Dade home. For years, the case remained tied to a man who police said had already confessed. But in August 2026, Alberto Sierra finally stood in court and admitted responsibility for the murders. The victims were his estranged wife, 29-year-old Gladys Machado, and her 2 young daughters, Julia and Daniela. And even after all those years, one question remained. What happened inside that home in November 2012? If you enjoy true crime documentaries, like this video and subscribe for more. This is the true story of Alberto Sierra and the Machado family murders. In 2012, Gladys Machado was living in northwest Miami-Dade with her daughters Julia and Daniela. She and Sierra had been married, but their relationship had become troubled. Sierra was no longer living with the family. There had also been earlier concerns about violence. Records reported by CBS and other outlets show that Sierra had a criminal history that included weapons and drug offenses. In 2010, he had also faced a domestic battery allegation involving Gladys. In 2011, another disturbing allegation surfaced. Julia, one of Gladys's daughters, told a teacher that Sierra had bitten her on the arm. The Department of Children and Families investigated the allegation, but the family remained together. Sierra was later sent to jail after weapons were found while he was on probation. He was released in June 2012. 5 months later, everything changed. On November 10th, Sierra went with Gladys and the 2 girls to the Mall of the Americas. According to the arrest affidavit and police account, an argument began between Sierra and Gladys. Police said Sierra pulled a knife and injured her. What happened after that became the foundation of the murder investigation. Investigators said Sierra forced Gladys and the 2 girls back to the house they had once shared, and once they were inside, the situation became deadly. But investigators would not discover what happened immediately. 3 days later, a neighbor became concerned about the home. The victims were found inside: Gladys, Julia, and Daniela. The investigation had now become a triple murder case, but detectives still had to answer a crucial question: who had done it? At first, Sierra was only someone investigators needed to question. And that would change very quickly, because when detectives began looking closely at his account of what happened, they found information that would eventually lead them back to the house. And then came the confession. The investigation changed quickly. When police first questioned Alberto Sierra, he was not charged. He voluntarily spoke with detectives and was released. At that point, investigators had not publicly identified him as a suspect, but detectives kept working. One detail stood out: Gladys's car was missing. Then investigators found it near Sierra's home in Kendall. Police also obtained a search warrant for the home of Sierra's mother, where he had been staying. The case was no longer simply about 3 unexplained deaths. Investigators were beginning to connect Sierra to the scene. And there was another piece of the puzzle. Before the murders, there had already been allegations of violence involving Sierra. In 2010, he had been accused of domestic battery involving Gladys. In 2011, one of the girls reportedly told authorities that Sierra had bitten her arm. A child welfare investigation followed. Those earlier allegations did not prove who killed the family, but they became part of the history investigators were examining. Then, on November 19th, police questioned Sierra again. This time, the investigation took a dramatic turn. According to police, Sierra confessed. Investigators said he described what happened after the argument at the mall on November 10th. The arrest affidavit alleged that he took Gladys and the girls back to their former home. Police said Gladys was killed there, followed by her 2 daughters. But investigators weren't finished. A confession was one thing. Physical evidence was another. And when detectives examined the evidence collected from the victims, they found something that could independently connect Sierra to the crime. DNA documents later obtained by CBS showed that DNA collected from one of the girls was matched to Sierra. The samples included material taken from nail scrapings, arm swabs, underwear, and clothing. That evidence gave prosecutors something more than Sierra's own account. It gave them forensic evidence that could be presented in court. By November 20th, Sierra had been arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional charges related to the alleged crimes. The case that had begun with 3 bodies and almost no public answers was now moving toward prosecution, but the evidence would raise an even darker question. What exactly happened inside that house? And what would prosecutors reveal about the final moments of Gladys, Julia, and Daniela? That was only the beginning of the case. For investigators, the confession changed the direction of the case, but a confession alone was not the only evidence they had. The physical evidence was becoming harder to ignore. Investigators had already recovered Gladys's missing car near Sierra's home. They had searched the home where he was staying, and forensic testing was now providing another connection. DNA collected from one of the girls was matched to Sierra, according to documents reported by CBS Miami. The samples included evidence collected from the girl's clothing and body. The case was no longer simply about what Sierra told detectives. There was evidence that prosecutors could take into a courtroom. But there was another disturbing part of the investigation. Authorities said the abuse of the victims continued after their deaths. Prosecutors alleged that Sierra sexually assaulted Gladys and Julia after killing them. Those allegations became part of the criminal case. The details were difficult to process, but for investigators, every piece of evidence had a purpose. It helped establish what happened. It also helped establish when the murders occurred and how Sierra was connected to the crime. And there was something else investigators had to consider: the history between Sierra and Gladys. Years before the murders, Sierra had been accused of domestic violence against Gladys. There had also been a child welfare investigation after an allegation involving one of the girls. Those earlier incidents did not prove that Sierra committed the murders, but they became part of the history surrounding the family. Then came the formal charges. Sierra was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was also facing charges related to kidnapping, armed burglary, and abuse of a dead human body. A grand jury later indicted him. That meant prosecutors could pursue the case as a capital murder prosecution, potentially exposing Sierra to the death penalty. But the case was not finished. For years, the courtroom proceedings continued. And almost 15 years after Gladys, Julia, and Daniela were killed, the case would return to the headlines. This time, Sierra would no longer be simply accused. He would stand before a judge and admit what he had done. And the question would become something different. After all those years, what punishment would he receive? Almost 15 years had passed. For years, the murders of Gladys Machado and her 2 daughters remained one of the most disturbing cases in Miami-Dade. But in August 2026, the case reached a new and decisive chapter. On August 7th, Alberto Sierra pleaded guilty in a Miami-Dade courtroom to the murders of Gladys, 8-year-old Julia, and 4-year-old Daniela, along with burglary, kidnapping, and abuse of a human corpse. There was no longer a question of whether Sierra would face trial for the killings. He had admitted responsibility, but the guilty plea did not immediately answer the final question: what would his punishment be? Prosecutors are seeking the death penalty. The defense is facing a different outcome: life in prison. A jury is expected to decide between those 2 possibilities later in August 2026, and that means the legal story is still unfolding. But to understand why this case has lasted nearly 15 years, we have to go back to the beginning, back to November 2012. Gladys Machado was 29 years old. Her daughters, Julia and Daniela, were only 8 and 4. They were found dead inside their Miami-Dade home on November 13th, 3 days after the killings. A neighbor had become concerned after noticing a foul odor coming from the residence. The discovery ended the uncertainty about what had happened to the family, but it began a much larger investigation. Sierra was eventually arrested after investigators connected him to the murders, and police said he confessed. According to the account reported in court records and news reports, Sierra told investigators that he stabbed Gladys and suffocated the 2 girls. The physical evidence added another layer. Prosecutors later said DNA evidence showed Sierra had also sexually assaulted the bodies of Gladys and Julia after their deaths. Those allegations became part of the prosecution's case. Now, nearly 15 years later, Sierra has admitted to the killings. But the story does not end with a guilty plea. Because for the Machado family, the question is no longer who was responsible. It is what justice will look like after all these years. And before the jury decides whether Alberto Sierra will spend the rest of his life behind bars or face the death penalty, the court must confront everything that happened to Gladys, Julia, and Daniela. For almost 15 years, the Machado family waited for the legal system to reach this point. Gladys Machado was 29. Julia was only 8. Daniela was 4. Their lives ended in November 2012, but the case continued through years of legal proceedings. Then, on August 7, 2026, Alberto Sierra entered guilty pleas in Miami-Dade County. He admitted responsibility for the 3 murders, along with kidnapping, burglary, and abuse of a human corpse. The plea changed the case forever. There would be no trial to determine whether Sierra committed the murders. He had admitted that he did. But there was still one major question left. What would his punishment be? Prosecutors are seeking the death penalty. Sierra's case will now move into the penalty phase, where a jury is expected to decide whether he receives a death sentence or life in prison. So, even after the guilty plea, the story is not completely over. Because justice in this case is no longer about discovering who killed Gladys, Julia, and Daniela. It is about determining the punishment for what happened to them. And there is another part of this story that should never be forgotten. Gladys was not simply a name in a police report. She was a mother. Julia and Daniela were not simply victims listed in a case file. They were 2 young girls whose lives were taken before they had the chance to grow up. Their younger brother survived because he was staying with a relative when the murders occurred. That detail makes the case even more painful. 1 child was away from the home. 3 family members would never leave it alive. The investigation eventually uncovered a confession, forensic evidence, and a history of domestic violence allegations surrounding Sierra and Gladys. But none of those facts can bring the victims back. What they can do is establish what happened and hold the person responsible accountable in court. And now, nearly 15 years later, Alberto Sierra has admitted his guilt. The final decision is still ahead. A jury will determine whether the punishment will be life in prison or death. Until that decision is made, the legal chapter remains open. But the names at the center of this case should remain clear. Gladys Machado, Julia, Daniela, 3 lives, 1 family, and a case that took nearly 15 years to reach this point. If you appreciate factual true crime documentaries based on verified evidence rather than rumors or speculation, please subscribe to True Crime by Zush and turn on notifications. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and remember, in true crime, the truth belongs to the evidence.